Just
there we are. It's come up now.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, I'll hand over to you now. So now we have Dr. Aimee Grant, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ella. Okay, so my name is Aimee Grant and I'm based in the Centre for Lactation, Infant Feeding and Translational Research, which is part of the School of Health and Social Care. And I'm a senior lecturer in public health, but I'm also a Wellcome Trust Career Development Fellow. So I do a lot of research on autism. As well as being a researcher, I'm actually a member of the autistic community, and I'm also otherwise disabled, so I'm a wheelchair user as well. And if you'd like to follow me on social media, I'm at Dr. Aimee Grant. So today I'm going to give you a little bit of a history of autism, and we'll be thinking about kind of the historical background. So autism's origins really, which coincided with Nazi genocide of autistic people, all the way through to today, where we're really arguing for the emancipation of all autistic people. I'll also cover a bit about terminology and some key things that you might not know about autism and autistic people. And I'll think about sensory challenges and then also some co-occurring conditions that autistic people have. So starting off then with a little bit of history about autism. So the word autism comes from the Greek word autos, which means self, and that was first seen in the medical literature in 1908, so, you know, just over a century ago. But under Nazi occupation of Austria, Hans Asperger was doing experiments on autistic children, and he divided them into two groups. One, he said, were like little professors, and he gave those his name. So that's where the term Asperger's syndrome comes from. And he compared those to your average autistic person who was not like a professor, who he called autistic psychopaths. At this time, those who were identified as having Asperger's syndrome were thought of as being useful, so they should be spared from death. But those who were merely autistic should be killed because that was a negative that they didn't want in society. So we've got this, whenever you're thinking about autism, we've got this really dark history. And the term Asperger's syndrome just isn't used these days. So I would never use it unless somebody used it about themselves first. Moving on from this, after the Second World War, there was a big push to get women out of the workforce, so the men returning from war had jobs. And at this time, they then said autism was caused by refrigerator mothers. So mothers being too cold would lead to your child being autistic, which is just fundamentally untrue. However, in terms of what we know about autism, the clinical guidelines keep on changing over time. And I think part of that is because we don't have good autism research. So most autism research is directed towards children. So in America, 98% of autism research funding was used on children a few years ago. And we have research leading to eugenics. So that's aiming to eradicate a group of people. And that's continuing, particularly at Cambridge University today. So the images on the slide are of the Stop Spectrum 10K logo and a protest outside Cambridge University, basically because they're collecting the DNA of autistic children without the children consenting or even being asked to assent. And they're going to be using that for prenatal testing to aim to abort autistic fetuses. So we've got this huge kind of political tension where often autistic people don't get to tell our own stories. Moving forward, then, the flip side of that is moving towards autistic liberation or the emancipation of autistic people. And that's really aligned with the social model of disability. So within the social model of disability, we would say that society is the cause of the disability rather than the individual's impairment. And so sometimes it can be easier to think about that in terms of a physical impairment. So I'm a wheelchair user. if I'm not able to park my car in a space where I can get my wheelchair out of the car, I can't access that space. So that would be an environmental barrier stopping me from being able to access space in the same way as a non-disabled person. When it comes to autism, we actually don't have those physical challenges, but they can be kind of more subtle and maybe not so obviously recognised by others. So I would argue that autism is a difference and not a deficit, which is the opposite of those other theories. And there's been some really interesting research over the past 15 years that looks at how autistic people communicate with each other, how non-autistic people communicate with each other, and then comparing autistic and non-autistic communication when they're together. And you can see then that those communication styles don't work so well together, but when autistic people are talking to each other, that works absolutely fine. And Damien Milton, who's based at Kent, argues that non-autistic people just aren't required to have empathy for autistic people, whilst autistic people are expected to change how they behave, how they communicate for the convenience of non-autistic people. And so something that I think is quite nice in terms of thinking about what the barriers are is Luke Bearden's golden equation. And that is autism plus environment equals outcome. So if an autistic person is having a really bad time, actually it's not just because they're autistic, it's those things in the environment that could potentially be modified to make things less difficult, less painful. So using a social model of disability, terminology is really important. So on the left-hand side of the table, there are some preferred words, and on the right-hand side, there are some words that are frequently considered offensive. So when we are talking about autism, we should just call it autism. So autism spectrum disorder, autistic spectrum condition, those are outdated. And actually the idea of a spectrum is now refuted. So going back to that golden equation, autism plus environment equals outcome, means that every autistic person in a really awful environment can be severely disabled. And as I've mentioned, Asperger's syndrome is just not a term I would ever use because of that Nazi eugenics connotations. When we're talking about somebody who is autistic, I would say that they're an autistic person or a group of people, autistic people. And we wouldn't use things like suffers with, and we also don't use person with autism. So in the UK, autistic adults have been really clear that they prefer identity first language. So autism comes before the person when you're describing it. And functional labels are also unhelpful. So saying someone is severely autistic or they have high functioning autism, because that's really going back to this idea that we need to get the environment right for that individual, and then they will have less outcomes that look negative in terms of perhaps their own mental health or their ability to engage in study or a workplace. And when we're looking at comparing autistic people to non-autistic people, we can either use the word allistic, so literally the word all and then istic. And neurotypical means anybody who isn't neurodivergent. So that's a bit wider than just not autistic. But you'll frequently hear things like, we're all a little bit autistic, and oh yeah, that happens to me too. And sometimes people even say normal people when they're contrasting autistic people, and those are all to be avoided. Oh, excuse my pop-ups. And if you're interested, I'll share these slides with Ella, and you can get more information following the link in the yellow box. So in terms of some other language around autism, Something that really fits well with that golden equation is the idea of masking. And that is the way that autistic people modify their behavior to fit into situations where neurotypical communication is required. And that is really, really energy intensive. Something else that happens, so something that would be considered an outcome in the golden equation, is that autistic people can become dysregulated. So that means that if we think that everybody starts with a bucket at the beginning of the day, and the bus being a bit late would be awful for everybody, but the bus being late and then struggling to buy your ticket, and then someone who smells bad sits next to you, and then they touch you, you know, we've got these things building up and up for an autistic person in a way that it wouldn't necessarily impact a non-autistic person. And so as that builds up, you're getting more and more dysregulated and overwhelmed. And when you get to the top of that bucket, you're going to have either a meltdown or a shutdown. So, and these are completely inevitable. They cannot be stopped once you've got to that point. So a meltdown is a big explosive burst of energy. It can be shouting, pacing, needing to jump up and down on a trampoline, you know, getting energy out of your body. Or the alternative is a shutdown where the person will really retreat into themselves. They might not be able to make any eye contact. They might not be able to talk. And at the most severe, they'll become catatonic, which means their body will become rigid. They won't be able to control their bodily functions. So they can be really quite severe. Now, the way we can stop people getting to that meltdown or shutdown is the buckets building up, and autistic people can do things to re-regulate. So these are known as self-stimulatory behaviours, and they can take you from here and just take you down a little bit. So that can be things like touching your fingers, fiddling with your hair, biting your nails, moving your body, pacing, flapping your hands, chewing, eating, drinking, all sorts of different things, and they can be quite individual. And often autistic children are told to stop stimming when they're in school, or they feel that they're not able to do that when they're in a workplace, for example. They might get stares from colleagues or being told that they're being weird or whatever. But stimming is really important because it's a circuit breaker. It stops you getting to the point of meltdown or shutdown. And that's important because if you're consistently melting down or shutting down, you'll enter autistic burnout. And that's a place where you'll lose skills. And that can take a really, really long time for people to recover. So I didn't used to be a wheelchair user, but I had such a severe autistic burnout from some really hideous bullying over a period of about 3 years, that my energy has never recovered. I've never been able to return to walking because of the severity of that autistic burnout. And we also know that autistic people have a suicide rate 9 times higher than non-autistic people, and that's higher for autistic women. So we've got really negative consequences from someone being told to stop twirling their hair. You know, these things matter to us. But so often we hear about these sorts of sensory challenges, but we don't always hear about the good things. So let's have a quick rundown of the sensory differences that autistic people have. So these can be in relation to sight, so light and movement, sound, so any background noise is completely intolerable to me. Touch, we might need to only wear clothing that feels pleasant to us, or at least not painful. And being touched by people can be very jarring for some autistic people, especially if it's unexpected. Smell can be difficult, and some of us aren't able to regulate our own temperatures very well. We'll also have challenges in terms of our processing speed. So if I had to sit in an office with background noise, with some bright overhead lights, maybe someone doing something annoying like sitting and clicking their pen as they're on the phone, I would have very reduced processing speed in my brain. So actually, I need to sit in an office by myself if I need to use my brain. But autistic people also have fantastic capacity for sensory joy. And there's a photo of my favourite tree, which is in my garden at home. And this makes me really, really happy. So I would say that seeing my tree every time I take my dog out to the garden to go to the toilet is almost like seeing an old friend you haven't seen for a long time. It's a warm, fuzzy feeling, almost a bit like having a hug. And non-autistic people don't seem to get the same level of sensory joy. And also, when autistic people are dysregulated, having additional sensory can be really beneficial. That can really help us to balance out that dysregulation. So we've got some challenges, but we've also got some real positives. And then lastly, when it comes to interoception, that's kind of the knowledge of internal bodily sensations. So for example, knowing that you need to go for a wee, or knowing that you're hungry. Often autistic people have them to a different level of non-autistic people. So often I'll find that I'm getting a bit grumpy, and then I'll realise I've been sat at my desk for 4 hours, I've not had a drink, I've not eaten, and I need a wee. So I don't get those cues in the same way as your average non-autistic person, but some people will feel them very, very intensely, so they can be really distracting. So that was a really brief overview of the history of autism and some things it might be helpful for you to know. I've included some links here to some autism affirming organisations and blogs, and also links to follow my research. But I'm happy for Ella to share these slides with you, and happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Aimee. That was really interesting. Has anyone got any questions for Aimee? Yes, Clark.
Can you hear me?
She probably can't hear you. Can you hear Clark, Aimee? If you
Not very well. Maybe if Clark speaks and you then repeat it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Coming up to the
brilliant.
front.
Right, is this possible? Can you hear me if I talk here?
Could you come a bit closer? Sorry.
Right,
So if I talk directly into the laptop, can you hear me?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So my question is, so I've been involved in and witnessed loads of situations where autistic people are talking to each other and talking through or past each other in a way where they think that they are saying something, or I think I'm saying, or someone else thinks they are saying something, which is perfectly clear. And then it either turns out that they were thinking about something else, or that they get into a big argument because they don't understand quite where a person is coming from exactly. And this seems to be, it is a feature of autistic neurotypical communication too, but like my classic example is when I threw a knife across the kitchen because another autistic person asked me to chuck a knife, you know, so like into the sink, and then the knife goes across the kitchen, everyone's like, okay, so what happened? Why did you throw the knife? And like, how does this stack up with what you said earlier about autistic people always being able to communicate with each other? Because in my experience, this is not really the case.
Thanks. That's a really, really clear and direct communication. It is absolutely the best way to communicate with autistic people. So the example of chuck, as in throw or please pass me, is something where there's been a miscommunication there. Research has found that autistic people communicating with each other have less miscommunicate, or a similar number of miscommunications to non-autistic people speaking together. And I wonder if perhaps some of the challenges when and I'm with you, I've been in autistic spaces where things can quite quickly so a minor misunderstanding can result in a lot of very hurt feelings. And I think that could be, I'll stop sharing my screen actually there because I've got pop-ups, because of something known as rejection sensitive dysphoria, so RSD. And that I think tends to be quite common in autistic and some other neurodivergent groups of people, where we've had lots of times in the past where we've almost been told off for the way we communicate. So then when there is a miscommunication, you've got all of that historical feelings of, I've been told off before for this, or things have gone badly before, which I think can then raise the level of dysregulation and can lead to those sorts of conflicts. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
That does make sense. I mostly wanted to hear how you'd answer the question because I wasn't really sure, but I appreciate the answer. It's a good answer.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Clark. So we've got time for probably 2 more questions. Has anyone got any other questions for Aimee? Okay, I'll jump in with a question of my own then. Before we adjourn. So you mentioned something about can you expand anything more about how autism is diagnosed in schools? Because you mentioned about different things to look out for, like twirling of hair or things like that. So yeah, can you expand a bit more on autism in young children or how it might be diagnosed?
Yeah, so diagnosis in Wales is for adults goes through the integrated autism service. So adults in Wales can now self-refer to get diagnosed. So if you search Wales Autism IAS online, you'll find out how you can refer yourself. There have been very long waiting lists for autism diagnoses. So autism is traditionally diagnosed by a psychiatrist. There are now increasing numbers of nurses and other allied health professionals like occupational therapists who have done the training to be able to diagnose autism. I don't think schools would be diagnosing. I think schools might be saying, typically they'll say something like, this child's behavior is wrong or disruptive or challenging, and they might bring that to the attention of the parents. The parents have already probably been trying to get something assessed or been taking their child to the doctors. So it is just quite a long struggle. For people aged under 25, in Wales, you can have an education and healthcare plan that talks about what schools should be doing to support individual children's needs. But I think, I mean, the whole of public services are kind of flagging, and, you know, there aren't enough teachers, there aren't enough teaching assistants, and the schools don't have enough budget for specialist resources and to bring in people. So at the moment, it is a bit of a postcode lottery, depending on where you live, as to what sort of support you might get at school.
That's great, thank you. So if no one's got any more questions, let's thank our speaker once again. Thank you very much, Aimee, for coming on. And I'll stop the recording now quickly.